Okay, so we have created all our 5 plants now. I'm going to come back up. Let's just hide our plant E, so all of these are now hidden. Let's now bring this into our main setup so we can set up our plants on our instance geometry. So let's just dive inside here. Let's come down to the bottom. You might remember we actually imported a few of these already. So it was just using an object merge to bring in the null at the end of each plant, and then we can wire these up to our copy to points. So we've got plant A so far. Just go back to our render camera here. We've got plant C. I'm going to copy this node and I'm just going to call this one plant B. Let's bring in that one. So let's go to plant B out. And of course, if we select copy to points, we are using pack and instance here. So we are obviously trying to be quite efficient with our use of memory. If I connect this one to plant B, you can see this is actually quite a heavy plant, so it's struggling a little bit here to display it all. I might, for now, while we're setting this up, just jump back actually to our plant B, and I'm going to reduce the number of spines on this plant itself. If we come down here, it was at this point here, this scatter, that kind of defined the number of spines on our object. So for now, let's just set this to be, instead of 1,000, let's go to 300. And once we've got things nice and set up, we'll come back and we'll readjust that back to 1,000 again. But this will keep things a little bit snappier. So back to our setup. I think I'm also going to change the number of points we're scattering overall as well. Currently got about 5,000. I think for my original setup that I came up with, it was about 4,000. So let's just bring that down a little bit more. So we can now see these for plant B. Let's copy this again and let's create, or let's bring in plant D. So that will be plant D out. This was kind of like our clamshell one. Just space these out a bit more. Gives a little bit more space here. And of course, our last one, plant E. So let's just bring that one in as well. There we go. So next we're going to take all of our plants together, and I'm just going to Alt drag out our little handle at the bottom here to merge these all together, and let's connect this into our copy to points. So currently we've merged all of these into one piece of geometry and we're copying it to copy to points, so we've got every plant on every point. What we actually want to do is distribute our plants over the points, so there's only one of each of these plants per point. And to do this we can actually use variants. So variants are essentially a nice way, sort of a nice and efficient way of tagging our geometry with an attribute. So each one of these would have a different variant attribute. We can then set up variant attributes on our points, and copy to points will match these two to essentially distribute this. So to do this, let's go to our copy to points. Let's come up here to piece attribute, enable that, and you can see by default this is called variant. Now we're going to create a variant attribute on each of our plants here. So let's start with a attribute create. Let's just call this one set variant. Connect that one up. It's going to be an integer attribute called variant. Let's just leave it a value of 0. Let's duplicate this and copy this to our next plant. Let's set this one to have a value of 1. Copy this again. This one's going to have a value of 2. Do this again. So we're just going up and we're creating an attribute that increases for each plant by 1. There we go. So now, even though we've got these all merged together, if we come to our spreadsheet, you can see we now have under points our variant, which is going to essentially group which plant we are. If we come over to our points before our copy to points, we could put down an attribute adjust integer. And we could use this to create an integer attribute on these points. Now actually by default, it is set up to use or set up to create the variant attribute. We're just going to set always. And if we click on our copy to points, you can see we can actually select our plant now just by going through this. So if it's set to 0, it's using our first. Set to 1, it's using our second, third, fourth, fifth. We could also use like random or noise. This is quite a nice way of setting things up. The one thing you've got to remember is we're just setting this attribute here. And currently we're using here this min max of 0 and 9. Now we've only got variance between 0 and 4. So we're creating a lot of points that have variants that don't have geometry associated with it. So you do need to remember to keep this in sort of alignment. So if I set this to 0 and 4, we now have this set up. And you could adjust your noise and things like that. Let's also just colorize this variant a second. I'm going to put down a color. It's going to make it a little bit easier to see things. And for now, let's just set this to be random from attribute. Let's use our variant attribute. So now we get a different color per plant. So this is one way of doing it, but there's actually a better way. Now with the latest version of Houdini, we've got what's called the attribute from pieces SOP. And we're going to use this one to assign our variants. So the nice thing about attribute from pieces is it allows you to sort of randomize your variant based on a number of different ways, but it's only ever going to give you variants based on what you feed into it. So you can take your geometry library here, and we're going to connect that up to our merged geometry. And we can connect our point cloud, which is essentially our points. Let's just connect that one up to our points before we adjusted the integer there. The nice thing about this is if we were to add more plants and add more variants, it will automatically update and assign and distribute those variants amongst it. So it kind of keeps everything in order, which is super cool. Let's delete this attribute adjust integer. Let's put the color after that. Connect this one up. And if we were to do this, we also need to change our piece attribute here to be called variant, so it lines up with what we've been doing. So this is creating the attribute called variant. This is now being read by copy to points, and we can now assign this like so. So by default, it's set to mode of cycle. So you can just adjust through your different models like this. It's essentially just cycling through the index. We've also got patches, which is pretty useful. So you can come here and you could change your patch size to adjust this. I might also come to my viewport display by pressing D, and under optimize, I'm going to try and increase this to maybe 150 million points. This might crash Houdini, but we're going to see. Hopefully this will give us a bit more view. It's a bit better. Okay, so we've got our patch size here, which we can adjust. We could also distort this. We've got like a strength here for distortion, and we can sort of adjust the size. So it's quite a nice way of adjusting things as well here. We've also got options to do things by noise. So noise size, we've got completely random. And we could also map an attribute, say maybe your p-scale, to the distribution of your variance. And you could also do this by vex as well. I think for us, I'm going to use noise for this. I'm going to come down and maybe reduce our noise size a little bit smaller, maybe around 0.1. I think I'm going to bring my roughness down so it's a bit smoother in its distribution. Let's have a look at just offsetting our pieces here. I think something like that. Let's just look through our render camera. I think this will do for now. In the next lesson, we're going to have a look at sort of refining this further.